Thank you very much for coming, especially as video recordings are available. I just wanted to let you all know that so the videos work, and the videos and the slides are going up on the departmental website in the 1A lecture notes section. I still had a few questions from people over the week about that, so if you don't know, that's where they are, and they'll go up one lecture at a time. Today is the second lecture in political obligation, and we're going to be moving from classical social contract theory to hypothetical social contract theory. Social contract theory associated with John Rawls and many others in contemporary moral and political philosophy as well. But before we do that, we need to revisit the objections that came into classical social contract theory at the end of last week. David Hume's two big bombshells. They're good objections, but we need to find out why they work, how they work, and why it is that they seem to work particularly well against the social contract theory offered by John Locke. So I will also be introducing Locke's social contract theory and talking to you a bit about that. In doing so, and in looking at his objection, we're going to be looking at some of the different ideas of consent that social contract theories have developed in order to explain social contract theory and why it justifies our obligation to obey the law. Then we're going to look at how it is that Rawls revolutionized social contract theory and actually pretty much all the political and moral philosophy by reframing social contract theory in terms of the hypothetical social contract, and that meant moving away from this naturalistic state of nature to an idealized hypothetical initial position. And finally, we're going to close by looking at why just about everyone has stopped trying to claim that we have political obligations because of the social contract. So, to start with Hume's objections, the bombshells from last week, doesn't social contract theory get something wrong in describing the kind of laws that we are supposedly obliged to obey? When it says that these laws are based on consent, doesn't it simply misrepresent the kind of laws we're talking about? After all, these laws are supposed to be universal. They're supposed to be non-voluntary, and they're supposed to be coercive. And even if we did come up with descriptions of these laws that maybe matched what the social contract theory was talking about, we still have a problem that that is not the way the political authority sees the laws that it imposes upon us. It does not see the justification for these laws as resting in the consent of those who are governed by them. His second objection was that social contract theory is claiming that people consent to these laws and to be governed by them. But how on earth can that be? Nobody ever asked us, do you agree to be obliged to obey these laws? And even if we try to make some case that, well, you consent because you're a citizen, because you're here, and you haven't gone anywhere else or done anything else, isn't that a really unfair test? Because all the alternatives are so very costly. And so Hume has this very colourful passage where he describes it as if we were prisoners taken aboard ship in our sleep and then told that we not only had to obey the master because he was stronger and had the whip, but that we were also morally obliged to obey the master even though we have nowhere else to go. We're stuck on a ship. The only alternative would be to jump overboard and most likely drown. Now, these are great rhetorical objections. I really hope that when you heard them, you were persuaded. They're very persuasive. But as philosophers, persuasion is not enough. As philosophers, we are engaged in logical argument and rational debate. So how do these objections work, and why are they so fatal? I think in order to really understand the objections, it's worthwhile considering a bit about the context in which Hume was making them. They come from this essay on the original contract that Hume wrote, and that is a very political essay. Hume is attempting to examine philosophically, and doing so in both a very sceptical and a very sarcastic style, but examine philosophically the philosophical claims being made by the political parties of his day. Now, these aren't parties in the way that we think of political parties. These are groups of loosely affiliated individuals who would campaign together in Parliament, who proposed legislation, but they were quite fuzzy. They certainly had groups who were around the edges, people would swap and change, and there was not the same kind of mass campaigning that we see nowadays. But still, there was strong identity between the two parties. And these are parties that in many ways have their origin in the English Civil War of the century before Hume. So at Hume's times, the two parties are, on the one hand, the Tories, a group of people who don't like some of the developments that have happened in English politics over the last 100 years, and who believe that kings rule by divine right. The monarch is God's representative on earth and should be obeyed as such. That is no moral argument, as we would see it, but it's quite a strong theological argument. Hume's rather devastating put-down in more or less a single paragraph is, aye, so kings rule by the divine right of kings, but why not also say that robbers rob by the divine right of robbery, and pirates attack shipping by the divine right of piratry? How can it simply be the case that we were put on earth to fill whatever position we end up filling? So he dismisses that really quickly, and indeed most of the essay is just about this second group, the Whigs, the party who are in favour of the reforms that have been going on in English politics, the increase in parliamentary sovereignty, the increase in discussion about democracy and about representation of the people, and the view that the country was going through a process of political reform towards a more utopian and a better constitution. This is a so-called Whig view of history. That when you look back through history, you see a constant one-directional process of political and social reform, and that process is moving in the right direction. Well, Hobbes doesn't fit into either of these two categories. He believes that kings should rule, and he's very much a political conservative, but he also believes in the social contract, that kings rule because their people consent to them ruling. Rousseau also doesn't fall into this dichotomy. He is in a way beyond the Whigs. He doesn't see that history has been a process of gradual reform and things getting better. He thinks things are actually pretty terrible. And what we need is a mass revolution and a complete change of constitution. He's a radical. So he is not exactly the person who Hume has in mind. The Whig philosopher of renown, and who Hume is almost certainly aiming his arguments at, is John Locke. Now, John Locke was writing before Hume. He's in the right time frame to be a main consideration. And Locke is someone who you will probably come across also in other fields, in particular in his views about epistemology, about how we learn and gain knowledge. And Locke thought that people were born as blank slates, as tabula rasas, and that all the knowledge that we have came from our observation of our environment. And this is I think this has some bearing on his political philosophy, and it made him very aware of how environments affect who we are and the kind of decisions we make. But here we're mostly interested in Locke's political philosophy. And Locke was a very political man. And I was going to tell you some stories about Locke's political endeavours, because when I first started looking at Locke about 15 years ago as a teenager, he was a sort of a great political hero of the Whig and Liberal movement. People thought that he might have been a spy, that he was definitely an agent of the Glorious Revolution, in which England decided to peacefully swap kings, or more or less peacefully swap kings, and Parliament passed the Bill of Rights, giving them effectively the tools to gain ultimate sovereignty over the political process. Then I went to university and I read up a bit more about Locke, and people said, oh, no, that's all in the past. Actually, Locke was a conservative for most of his life. He was very subservient to his employer, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the First Lord of Shaftesbury, who was a Whig, but Locke was really just a mind for hire. And they pointed out that he wrote this document, the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which was a rather misguided attempt to introduce monarchy and nobility into the United States. Ultimately failed. Nowadays, actually, it looks like Locke's scholarship has moved on again. Now, we don't know. It seems like Locke was writing about liberal theory and liberal thought before the Glorious Revolution, although he never published until afterwards, and he always published not using his own name. It also appears now that his great inspiration, a guy called Algernon Sidney, was actually a double agent working for the King of France, and was actually just trying to destabilise the English monarchy. But anyway, Locke is a very colourful character, very involved in the politics of his time, and he is a man on a mission. He wants to change the way that we think about the English Constitution. Whether because he was paid to do that, or whether because he believes it, we no longer know. Hobbes and Locke agree quite a lot about the basics of social contract theory and how it works. They both agree that we were in a state of nature before the invention of societies, and that in that state of nature we face this competition between our moral law, the natural law, which we were aware of, but also our present self-interest and awareness of the immense threats that others presented to us. There are, however, two main ways in which Hobbes and Locke differ, which really explain, I think, the basis of Locke's social contract theory. So the first of these is that Locke, unlike Hobbes, thought that there was a conflict between morality and self-interest, but that it would not be the case that morality couldn't be realized in the state of nature. The reason for this is rather vague, but it may simply be, as I put it here, that Hobbes is probably an atheist and thinks that things just are the way they are. Whereas Locke is certainly not. Locke does seem to be quite devout in his Christian belief, and he seemed to have been convinced that if God created something, in this case the natural law, he would have done so for a purpose, and not just for it to sit there not doing anything. So Locke comes up with an argument for how it is that the natural law can be realized in the state of nature. And the argument is this, that when we feel a sense of morality and natural law, this doesn't only govern the way that we want to treat other people, we don't want to do to them things that we wouldn't want them to do unto us, but it also affects the way that we view situations as a third party. If we see someone else acting in justice, morality encourages us to intervene. Self-interest wouldn't, but our sense of the moral law says, if A does to B something that we wouldn't want either A or B to do to us, we should intervene and stop that from happening. Similarly, morality in the moral law inculcates us with a sense that it is right and just for others to intervene against us when we act morally, at least in part, even though it's in our self-interest that they don't. As a result of these two psychological forces, therefore, we can actually achieve morality in the state of nature, because we can all act as the police force that will ensure that the moral law is upheld. And by policing the interactions between others, can achieve a much more complete realization of that law than anyone could if they were only involved in two-way interactions. Thus, he says, individuals are going to form political societies, or politic societies as he puts it in the language of his time. But groups of individuals who realize the moral law for one another through these third-party relationships. Wherever you find people living in close enough proximity and cooperating often enough, you will get a stable enforcement of a set of norms, purely by natural processes alone. So that's great. So we have morality in the state of nature, so why do we need the social contract? Well, Locke makes a move somewhat similar to the one that Rousseau took, that we saw last week, which is that once people get to cooperate, societies start to grow, and small initial societies, quite probably families, villages, tribes, and so on, start to merge. And the political society becomes complex, unequal, and it becomes increasingly inconvenient for every individual to have a concern for the behaviour of every other individual. And thus the moral law actually gets harder and harder to enforce as the society gets bigger and more complex. Thus, societies, political societies, tend towards a state of war. Not the state of nature, as Locke presumed, but actually the developed society is the origin of this slide towards the state of war. To avoid this, Locke argues, political societies will form governments. They will decide upon the principles that they want to be governed by centrally, and they will appoint representatives, be they monarchs or republics, assemblies, or other forms of government, to protect these principles generally, and to have a concern for the political society as a whole. So that whilst each individual is still left with the authority to police, say, their local community, their local family or association, the country as a whole is governed over by special agents of the state. However, this rulership of this government is conditional. It actually has to do what it was appointed to do. it has to uphold people's natural rights. Life, liberty, and property, as Locke put them. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as is later interpreted in the American Constitution would have it. The second way in which Locke differs from Hume follows pretty much directly, Locke differs from Hobbes, follows pretty much directly from this. For Hobbes, what we consent to in the political contract is the ruler. We consent directly to the monarch or sovereign, and we consent to be ruled by them. For Locke, however, the ruler or sovereign is merely the agent of the political society. So we don't consent to them directly. What we consent to is being part of a political society with a government. Now this changes the nature of consent for Locke as compared to Hobbes. Hobbes sees consent as resting in mere subjugation. Merely allowing yourself to be ruled is, for Hobbes, to consent to being ruled. And this is most obvious when Hobbes talks about invasions and sovereignty by acquisitions. That if one sovereign takes over the realm of another sovereign, and the subjects of that other sovereign cease to resist the invasion, then they have consented to be ruled by this new sovereign. Locke, however, wants consent to mean something quite a lot more than this. And this becomes apparent in two important passages. The first of which is when Locke is talking about how individuals form political societies. And he says explicitly that everyone would remain in a state of nature unless they themselves agree to be part of the political society. And this makes sense, because remember that joining a political society is quite an active process. It involves actively upholding norms for everyone else in that society, and accepting their authority to uphold norms against you. You cannot passively join a political society merely by being in the same area as others, because if you don't police their norms, then you are not a member of the political society. However, the problem is, once there is government involved, everyone in a political society is subject to their government, and the government cannot tolerate people being in that area who are not part of that society. Every village, every tribe or family or association may recognise certain people in their midst as outcasts, as people who don't really belong there. But governments can't do that, because they have a concern for the interests and the morality of everyone. The second reason that consent is much more troubling for Locke is that because the rulership of government is conditional upon them holding people's natural rights, it becomes very important to note that all governments do not only respect people's natural rights, they also violate them. Governments uphold people's liberty by imprisoning criminals who might otherwise enslave or kill. Governments uphold people's property, but in so doing have to tax them to get the money to pay for the police and the army to protect their property. So this raises an important question about what Locke sees as the individual's consent to be part of a political society. And here are two of the three different kinds of consent we're going to discuss. The third one will come up in about 20 minutes, half an hour. The first of these is actual consent. This is where I say, is it okay if we do this? Or do you mind if I lecture at you for an hour? And you, of course, say yes, because your lectures are ever so insightful and useful for passing my exam. So, of course, that's absolutely fine for you to stand up and hold the floor for an hour. This is obviously what most of us mean by consent, and certainly within the criminal law and within laws about things like medical ethics and lots of other traditions. This is all that consent can mean. Tacit consent is not a play. But no one asks you if you mind being governed. No one asks you if you want a particular law to apply to you. So whilst Locke does seem to think that actual consent is how we form political societies in the first place, he certainly does not take the view that it is actual consent that holds political societies together and gives individuals the obligation to obey governments. Instead, he appeals to this notion of tacit consent. Tacit consent does not mean that you have expressed any particular willingness to go along with something, but merely that your actions imply that you have done so. So in fact, I never asked you if you consented to me lecturing you like this, but you're all sitting there as a receptive audience, typing away, making notes, looking interested, and generally taking in my every word. So it's reasonable for me to assume that if you were asked, you wouldn't say, no, 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 I completely don't hold with this. Who does this man think he is? We tacitly consent to govern, then, when we remain in a state, for Locke. And he has this line about anyone who possesses or enjoys part of a state, therefore tacitly consents to be governed by that state. And it is that that then obliges us to obey the law. If the magistrate says to you, you're obliged to obey this law, and you say, no, I never consented, he said, well, if you didn't consent, then why did you take all these benefits from the taxes that we paid? Why did you make use of all these public services? Why did you continue to live here and to benefit from other people obeying the law so freely, but then not expect the law to obey to you? Surely you have consented. So here, in a nutshell, is Locke's argument. The first premise, I will move this, the people are obliged to obey the laws of any government that upholds their natural rights of the members of that political society to which they have consented to be a part. You consent to be part of a society. That society appoints the government to uphold its members' natural rights. You are obliged to obey the law of that government. So when have you consented? Premise 2. You've given your tacit consent to be part of a political society so long as you hold any possession or enjoy any part of that society. And he makes this quite explicit. Whether this be barely to travel freely on the public highway. From this, then, Locke gains his conclusion that we are obliged to obey the laws of our governments, although we may seek to replace these governments if they no longer uphold and protect our natural rights. But if we don't replace them, then we have to obey their laws. Now, I don't know if you've had enough logic lectures, so you come across arguments, but the idea of the arguments is if you accept premise 1 and you accept premise 2, you have no choice but to accept the conclusion. This is how philosophical argumentation is meant to work. It's rather like the conditional statements that we were talking about. If you accept the antecedent, then you have to accept the consequent. Only here we have multiple antecedent statements, and you can have much more logical complexity than a mere conditional. But this argument seems valid. It does seem that if you accept Locke's premises, P1 and P2, you really have to accept his conclusion that you are obliged to obey the law. So that's good. But now we return to Hume's objections. And I think we can see much more clearly why these objections work, how they work, and why they're good philosophical objections. So Hume objects to Locke's premise P1, that we are obliged to obey the law of a political society that upholds our rights. And his objection is that the law of these political societies is not the kind of law that Locke describes. That we might be obliged to obey the laws of these societies if they were conditional laws. If they said, for everyone who has consented to these laws, insofar as they uphold your natural rights, you are obliged to obey. But that's not how the laws of the land are expressed. They are not conditional laws. They are absolute laws. They apply to everyone. No government of Hume's time saw itself as governing as a means of upholding the rights of its citizens. Now some do. It's arguable that they do in practice, but at least they make that claim. No government ever has said these laws only apply to those who consent to them applying. So look, you come up with an argument for why we should obey some kind of law, but not the laws of the states we're actually in. And if you were to go out and say that the laws of the country of the state we were actually in are the sort of laws that you have described, you would be locked up as seditious, or your friends would seek to lock you up as insane. Hume's second objection also works perfectly against Locke's second premise. Locke claims explicitly that it's our being in a country that means that we have consented to the law of that country. And this is exactly the situation that Hume is describing. Is it really simply our being on a ship that means that we've consented to the law of the captain, even if we had no choice whether to be there or not? So these objections fit Locke's argument. We can see how either one of them would be sufficient to defeat Locke's argument, but together they've been a powerful counterexample. We don't have to accept P1, we don't have to accept P2, so we don't have to accept Locke's conclusion. How about Hobbes and Rousseau? Well, here's an attempt to reconstruct Hobbes' argument. And immediately one notices it's harder to do this. I'm taking more liberties with Hobbes' text to make it fit the same kind of pattern as Locke's. But here's an attempt. So Hobbes says that people are obliged to obey the laws of any ruler whom they consent to be ruled by as a means of limiting the natural desires of the people and thus avoiding a state of war. Well, that's pretty similar. The reasons why we are supposed to consent to these laws are different. We're consenting to a ruler rather than to a political society, but still the obligation based on consent. It's the same idea. We can see the similarities and the family resemblance between Locke and Hobbes here. However, the P2 is obviously much different. People consent to be ruled just insofar as they submit to being thus ruled and subject themselves to the authority of the ruler. So as a result of these different premises, Hume's objections also turn out quite differently. In particular, his objection to that we don't actually give the consent being described is, I think, much more suspect here. In particular, I think that Hobbes could easily respond to Hume and his example of the ship. One imagines that he would say that would not the mariner taken aboard a ship have reason to submit to the captain, and would they not in fact submit to the captain? Why? Because the captain is in charge of the ship, and without the captain, the ship will be lost and they will be drowned. And they have no reason to want to be drowned, so they have every reason to submit and hence to give this kind of consent that I'm looking for here. Sure, there was something unfair in them being carried on ship against their will, but I'm not arguing that it is their merely being there that constitutes consent, but rather their realization of their interest and their subsequent submission is the reason that they consent. However, I think in making this move, Hobbes actually makes Hume's first objection even more telling. Because if Hobbes is implying that merely to submit to a ruler is to consent to their rule and hence to be obliged to obey their laws, doesn't it follow that we can simply ignore laws by withholding our subjection, by withholding our submission? What is the additional reason that is supposed to be coming here to imply that we have to obey the law whether we like it or not? Isn't all that Hobbes is really supplying an extra reason for why we might wish to obey the law? So Hume's argument works well. It does defeat Hobbes' argument. It defeats it because it denies the first because it denies the first premise, that people actually give this submission and that this is a reason for being obliged to obey the law come what may. It doesn't seem so telling against the second premise. Now that is fine for defeating an argument. You can use Hume's objections as an argument against Hobbes, but you have to be more careful in applying it. You have to think more about exactly what it is in Hume that objects to exactly, something exact. You have to work out exactly what it is in Hume that defeats one of the premises of Hobbes' argument. And it's not such a neat bit, but it works. What about Rousseau? Well, Rousseau's argument is in many ways even more complex, but here's my rough first pass as to how you can put it in the same premise-conclusion format. So people are obliged to obey the laws of any government that is expedient to facilitating cooperation and enterprise within their community, and is thus supported by the general will. people give their consent to uphold the general will of their community so long as they remain within its domains. This is the tacit consent argument, very similar to Locke's, if you want it's different. Now, it has to be said that Rousseau has this rather wonderful footnote in which it's, oh, well, I mean, unless they have family or property or there's some kind of violence to keep them in place, or they can't find anywhere else, they can't get asylum anywhere else, which he then completely ignores. As far as Rousseau is concerned, this is a vanishingly small group of people. I presume because it doesn't include Rousseau, who is an itinerant poor philosopher who is nevertheless able to gain friends in the educated middle and upper classes across Europe, and thus always can find a place to go whenever any state chucks him out. But this vanishingly small group of people who are anyone other than Rousseau, we're not interested in that. Anyway, it's a bit of a problem, but Rousseau definitely thinks that this form of consent is the form of consent that applies to individuals. So how do Hume's arguments work against Locke? Well, in this case, it's the first objection that doesn't seem so problematic for Rousseau. Remember that Rousseau is not a fan of the laws that we face. He thinks that they remove our freedom unnecessarily, that they promote conflict, and that they are generally trouble. He wants to overthrow them, and he acknowledges, or is forced to acknowledge, that this is sedition and treason. He has to acknowledge this because countries keep on chucking him out. Indeed, it's not at all unlikely that Hume had in mind Rousseau when he wrote his description about how the magistrate would imprison you if your friends had not done so for being insane first, because Hume and Rousseau were good friends. And about 15 years after Hume wrote on the original contract, he does indeed offer asylum to Rousseau when he is kicked out of the Swiss canton of Bern. Says, you can come and stay with me in Scotland. But stop spouting the sedition, one presumes. However, he still has problems with his views about consent. He thinks that this footnote spelling out all these people who we may understand having given their consent can just be left, and that indeed consent is how the political contract operates. But I think that most of us would feel that the cost of leaving our political society is really quite great, whatever position we're in. There are not that many Rousseaus in the world who think nothing of flitting about from state to state to try and find somewhere more politically convenient for them. So if that's the case and we haven't given our consent, why would any of these laws bind us? Why should we care about what the general will of our community is, given that we haven't consented to it governing us? So Hume's objections work. They work well. They're rhetorically excellent, they fit Locke perfectly, and they work against Hobbes, Rousseau, and other social contract theories. In fact, they more or less buried all talk of the social contract within English political philosophy, at least, for about 200 years. Very few references to social contract theory. Burke is the obvious exception to that. But for about 200 years following Hume's publication of On the Original Contract, it is decisive. It also pretty much ends all discussion of the social contract as being the origin of political obligation. However, we will come to that shortly. But discussion of the social contract theory did eventually re-emerge in post-World War British and American political philosophy. And that is through John Rawls, who is another name who will come up again and again, especially if you are interested in carrying on moral and political philosophy. But Rawls' concept of the social contract is very different to that of the classical social contract theorists. Although he draws on them heavily, and there are many similarities, his view about the nature of consent and the social contract is not that there is any actual contract, or even any tacit contract, but that there is a purely hypothetical contract. And the hypothetical contract says simply, if you were placed in a certain set of idealized conditions and asked to make a certain agreement, this is an agreement that you would make. How on earth does that have any moral force? Well, I'm going to run through just the very beginnings, just a very few pages of Rawls' argument. I'm going to miss off all the good stuff about what's in this agreement and just try and work out how it is that a merely hypothetical contract can be used to found morality. So Rawls is very analytical. He tells you exactly what he's going to do, and most often what he does is to describe and define the terms of the debate that he's making and the terms of the inquiry that he's making. And from the descriptions that he provides, he draws out the necessary logical conclusions as to what the answer to his questions are. And the question that he's interested in is very narrowly defined. It is what are the principles of justice that would regulate a well-ordered society? The key things here are the principles of justice, what are those? Society, what is that? And well-ordered society, what is that? Well, societies are, for Rawls, a more or less self-sufficient association of persons who, in their relations to one another, recognize certain rules of conduct as binding, and who, for the most part, act in accordance with them. This is somewhat of a strange description. I don't know if we would accept that this is what a society is. I mean, maybe we would. If you think about a student societies are defined in many ways by their constitution, by their members agreeing to pursue common aims, for the society to be governed according to certain sets of rules. Maybe this is right. Maybe society at large is simply the same thing, that we generally agree some kind of principle of cooperation and, on the whole, stick to them. These principles will be the principles of natural justice, culture, the norms that govern social interactions, and, as a subsection of that, the political laws and obligations. Such societies, however, are governed by this conflict between a common self-interest and individual self-interest over the products of their cooperation. And this should sound very similar. This is at the heart of the social contract theory, whether it be hypothetical or classical, that there is a conflict, there is a problem that we are seeking to solve. For Rawls, this problem is actually Rousseau's problem, much more than Hobbes and Locke's. The self-interest that we have, the collective self-interest, is that through cooperation we can make much more and do much more than we can individually. So we all want society to flourish, to achieve, to cooperate, to build, to be economically active. But that's not all we want, because we don't just care that society produces much. We also care about how that product is distributed. In particular, we'd rather like to have more of it and have others have less, than to have less of it and have others have more. Collective action problem. If we just focus on our individual self-interest, we squabble over the products of society, we withhold our cooperation when we think that it's unfair, society doesn't flourish, there's much less to go round, everyone suffers. If all we do is to care about collective self-interest, we work really hard, society does well, but we are left behind. Other people prosper from the good of our own labours, because that product is produced collectively by cooperation and they are in a position to seize it. To solve this problem, therefore, Rawls says every society has to come up with a set of principles that people uphold and know that others uphold that govern how the products of cooperation are to be distributed. This is a precondition for forming a society on Rawls's model. There are lots of ways that this can happen. You can have a centralized dictatorship in which everything goes to the center. They provide protection, they provide illusory protection in the sense of if you don't pay your taxes, we come and beat you up. And they take pretty much everything and leave everyone else barely able to survive and continue to produce. That's fine. That is a principle of social justice on Rawls's account. It could also be extremely egalitarian. The principles of distribution are strict equality. No one is to have any more than anyone else. Rawls is concerned that under such a society, were it ever to be achieved, there would be no incentive to work harder than anyone else, because you could not gain anything more. And so this would be a problem, because society would not flourish and benefit from the potential industry that everyone could put into it. So that's not what Rawls is after, but that's another principle of social justice. What Rawls wants is the best principles of social justice, the principles of social justice that would apply to a well-ordered society. And in a well-ordered society, everyone accepts and knows that the others accept the same principles of justice, and the basic social institutions generally satisfy and are generally known to satisfy these principles. Now, the key thing about the well-ordered society, then, is that nobody is having a principle of justice imposed upon them. Nobody is thinking, well, I would work harder if I could only benefit, but I can't benefit, so I'll not. Nobody is thinking, oh, I wish that I could have more of the benefits of my labours. I'm not benefiting out of these social arrangements, but I won't speak up because the ruler or the priest will just come and take everything I have and or kill me, and it will go very badly. In the well-ordered society, everyone is basically happy with the principles of justice and would accept them, knows that everyone else is happy with them and would accept them, and what is more, these principles of justice are actually being realised. So from these very basic, quite definitional points, Rawls gets this conclusion that the principles of justice, let's not worry about the basic structure, you will find out about that in due course, but of society are the principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality as defining the fundamental terms of these associations. Now what that means is we can work out what the principles of justice in a well-ordered society are from first principles. Because everyone will be happy to uphold these principles, knowing that everyone else will be happy to uphold these principles, we can simply ask what kind of society rational individuals would most like to live in if they knew that they started off in positions of equality. And in particular for Rawls, what that means is if they did not know what position in society that they would take. So there's a thought experiment of the initial position that Rawls puts forward. You know that you are producing a society that you will live in, but you don't know what position you will have in that society. And Rawls thinks that if you enter into this thought experiment and do so rationally and fairly and accepting the conditions of the thought experiment, you will arrive at his principles of justice. His principles that would govern a well-ordered society. I don't want to go into what these principles are particularly, as I say, but this is ultimately the justification that Rawls then offers for why these principles are the principles of justice. These principles would then be the principles that would allow us to avoid the conflict between our individual self-interest and our collective self-interest. So the social contract for Rawls is not a means of justifying the state that we are in at the moment. Trying to work out what this ideal constitution will be is not a means of trying to work out why we should obey the laws of our current constitution, but it is a means of working out what justice is. Rawls believes that the principles of social justice that would govern a well-ordered society just are justice. That whilst there are other principles of social justice, they are less just, and determinedly so. But why does this matter? What sort of force does the mere fact that we could all uphold the same principles of justice in an ideal society have to imply that we ought to uphold these principles. Ronald Dawkins thinks not a lot. He has this wonderful quote: a hypothetical social contract is not worth the paper it isn't written on. Fair enough. Hume also has a rather wonderful take on this. He famously says you cannot extract an ought, a claim about what you have to do, from an is, a claim about the world. And if we look at what Rawls has described, he simply said that, look, here's a hypothetical situation, and here are the principles of justice that people would uphold in that situation. But that doesn't actually have any oughts in it at all. It's not a moral argument per se. So does Rawls think that we are obliged to obey the law? Yes, he does. Does that have anything to do with the social contract? No. What is it? Next time. Thank you very much.